Good afternoon. My name is David Savage. I'm Nash Squared's Group Technology Evangelist. And this afternoon, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this cybersecurity focused webinar where I'm joined by three experts to discuss a whole range of topics. I feel that I will be referee in today's discussion as much as anything. Look, as digital business leaders, you all have to be on the lookout for new risks and threats that could potentially harm your businesses and companies. In recent years, we've seen obviously a huge rise in cybercrime, ransomware attacks, supply chain security issues, and many more, with new technologies obviously emerging all the time, likes of ChatGPT. The risk of being attacked is growing exponentially. So how can you make your business secure? And how can you protect your data? I'll be honest, I sometimes get asked to host cybersecurity panels at the likes of Web Summit and the like, and I often say no, because it's a subject that I feel wildly out of my depth on, so this should be a fun hour. But look, we've got a whole bunch of questions to get through, and we'll start by introducing our panelists, and I think to start with, we'll go over to Helsinki and ask Christine, would you tell us who you are, who you work for, and a tiny bit about yourself in the next 30 seconds or so?
Thank you, Dave. So Christine Beherasco, I work with WithSecure, which is a cybersecurity company based in Helsinki, and we essentially have offerings from services to products of different types. And my background has been, I've been in cybersecurity for 2 decades, and I feel a bit old saying that, but that 2 decades, a lot of it has been involving in building products, capabilities to protect different customers and their devices. And this year, I became CISO of this organization. Happy to be here.
Thank you. We'll cross over the Atlantic to the Mid-Atlantic and say hello to Jason.
Good morning. How is everyone? So I am a aged, experienced, and somewhat wise CISO. I've done everything that there is to do in cyber. Just began my 38th year in this space. And mostly my career has been about being in the right place at the right time. This was not always an issue that anybody cared about, let alone, thriving organizations. The US government in particular was one that they created a little law called the Computer Security Act in 1986. And that's essentially when I started at Booz Allen, and the two things lined up. I did some work in Intel. I did some work for a lot of government organizations. I took that experience and then went and launched the cyber practice of a consulting firm. The middle third of my career, I went inside into industry. I was the CISO for one of the state governments. I was the CISO at several small companies you've never heard of, and then several large multinationals like General Dynamics and Computer Sciences Corporation. I then went to work for one of the standards bodies. And now with the third of my career, I'm about giving back. I'm one of many increasing CISOs working as a virtual CISO for multiple different companies. I support a company in the healthcare space, one in the manufacturing space, one in professional services, and then I'm also the CISO in residence at the Maryland Innovation Center, which is an incubator in the state of Maryland, and I help 60 early stage startups grapple with these same issues.
Amazing, thank you. And then lastly, but by no means least, we've got Jim, our very own group CISO. Would you just like to introduce yourself quickly, Jim?
Yeah, thank you, David. Jim Tiller, CISO for Nash Squared. It's interesting, Jason mentions 38 years. That's wow. So for me, this year is officially my 30th year. I work for organizations, for example, like we were just talking recently about times at Lucent Technologies, Bell Labs, Hewlett Packard, British Telecom, things of that nature. And I've spent a lot of my career, virtually all of it, helping organizations deal with their cybersecurity needs, small, medium, and large. And so dealing with cyber has been, over the years, have been really amazing. And Dave, you said it perfectly, is like we're dealing with a lot of attacks. It's in some cases overwhelming. And it's interesting to be at this point in time in my career, at this point in time with cyber. It's been a very interesting ride in my third, shall we say, just like Jason.
Well, look, we've got some prepared questions, but I dare say that those watching will have better questions. So if you've joined the panel, please do pick up on points that are being made, or join the event rather, pick up on points being made by the panel and put those questions in the chat. And as we go along, I'll try and introduce those into the conversation. So please do be active participants today. Use that chat functionality and get your questions across as we chat through the course of the next hour. But Jim, I'll stick with you for the first question. We talked about the fact that digital business leaders are on the lookout for new risks and threats. Do you feel that executives understand security, or what do they understand about security at the moment? And what do you think they need to know? What do you think their current understanding level is?
I would say my first reaction to that is sometimes security just seems overwhelming, right? I mean, look at the news. We have all types of hacks that coming at you from every direction, ransomware. And as humans, I think we struggle with things that just seem overwhelming. There are times when you look at the news, various hacks, stolen, now we have executives in cyber and board members being exposed to personal liabilities. And, there was recently jail time sentence for a CISO. So the role of security within the business has elevated exponentially, and the threats have been exponential. And I think when people think about cybersecurity, I think it ultimately kind of concerns them in their core a little bit, and they seem like it's unachievable. Okay. So I think right now is like everybody's really exposed to cybersecurity from a threat perspective, and it seems overwhelming at times. And so I think what people need to really kind of focus on is it is achievable, but the key aspect here is knowing where to put your money, your time, and your effort. Right. So when things are just coming at you from every direction, focus on the ones that could have the greatest impact, focus on the ones that you think you can have a positive influence in mitigating in some way, shape, or form. And I would say, last comment here is on this topic is I've seen a pendulum go back and forth between technology focus and risk and compliance focused. And I think that pendulum has been stuck in the technology space for a while. And I think we're seeing a more emphasis on the risk and compliance side of things, mostly around risk. And that's where I would tell people to really focus their energy so they can prioritize. But basically what I think they think now is it's coming at me from every direction. It's impossible to be secure. But in reality is you focus and then you can make things happen.
Just before, obviously, Jason and Christine jump in and add their thoughts to this, you mentioned about that personal liability aspect. Do you think that's helpful or not? Because I could see that going in two directions, that if someone feels that they're personally liable, they might run scared. They might stick their head in the sand a little bit, as opposed to what you might imagine they would do in terms of kind of ramping up their personal understanding.
Well, I'll just refer to a report that Gartner put out a couple of weeks ago saying 25% of CISOs are going to quit and like get out of the business altogether, not like go into consulting, security, or whatever. So we have a vast number of people that are in what I'll say in the sort of getting it done space that are leaving the industry. And we have people at the executive level leaving the industry at an alarming rate because the stress is pretty high and there is personal liability that's getting ratcheted up. And if we look at just here in North America or United States with the SEC driving more expectations around what it means to be a public company and the role of cybersecurity, it's only going to go up. So I don't know if it's going to have a positive, I don't know what it's going to do, but I think it's going to concern a lot of people.
To build a little bit, by the way, on what Jim has been saying, to be honest, I don't think it doesn't help that all of this is scaring the experts who have years of experience to help manage organizations improve their cybersecurity, because there is now an additional implication that for them personally, it's really going to cost them beyond just their jobs. So the challenge on this now is the executives in the different organizations, there needs to be a little bit more understanding that for the CISO role, if we don't give them, for instance, in the organization, high enough authority such that they are able to make an impact, to make decisions, even on an executive level, but they have sort of like quite a bit of impact when it comes to the downside, but they don't get a lot of the upside, then I don't think it's helpful in general to the cybersecurity posture of our organizations without that level of understanding.
Jason, just to bring you in on this, I think listening to that point about, was it 25% thinking about quitting? You're a virtual CISO, that might be quite a good thing. There's a lot of organizations out there who've got knowledge leaving their organization and suddenly needing some expertise, right? Well, what's your view on this with regards to the current understanding? You're in that position of being able to work across a number of organizations.
Sure, I'll come back to the virtual CISO model in a minute. But I'd like to use that statistic because I think it answers the question that you asked. What do they understand about cyber, and what should they understand? I think it's on everybody's radar, right? It's in the media. If you're a senior executive, the CEO, you are being asked questions by your board. Are we on top of this? I don't think they have an adequate understanding, but if you put it in the right terms, and that's really goes to the role of the CISO. And I should put a caveat. Obviously, the level of understanding you have very much depends on what sector you're in, how demanding your customers are, what kind of data you work with, what geography, et cetera. Because look, I don't care what business you're in, you need two things to succeed: access to capital, access to customers. And CEOs know that, they get that. But in 2023, those are questions of confidence and trust, right? Your investors aren't going to invest in you if they don't think you're going to get a return. Same thing with your partners. Your customers know that as part of doing business together, you're collecting data about me. If you don't show them a level of respect and show a level of appropriate care for the data that you're capturing, and only capture that which you need, and then not share it with other people, it's kind of the privacy side of it, but that's part of this. Then they're going to take their business elsewhere. So the CEOs get that. Where it falls down is they have a C-suite already established. And I don't know that the CISO is a firm member of that table in all organizations. They need to be, and here's why. If you think about it in this perspective, the C-suite is nothing more than a division of the risk pie, not security, right? Lose the word security. For something to be secure, I'd have to take this laptop, I'd have to shut it off, take it, disconnect it from the power, disconnect it from the network, lock it up, put it in a box, put the box in a closet. Is it secure? I have no idea, right? But I know it's perfectly useless, right? We have to expose ourselves to a certain amount of risk by default just to do what we need to do to get the jobs done, to fulfill the mission of the company. So you've got somebody called counsel or outside attorney that you work with on your legal risk. You have a CFO or an outside CPA firm that you work with on your financial risks. Why aren't you working with and empowering and having that conversation with your CISO relative to your information and protection and compliance and the related set of risks? Now, for some organization, they're already having that conversation with their CIO or their CTO. But I want to move ahead a little bit to kind of what the role is of a CISO. I think many executives understand it to be solely that of a defensive coordinator on an American football team. Right? Keep the other team from scoring. And certainly that is a big part of what the cyber department is to keep bad actors out, prevent impermissible use and compromises of accounts and everything else. But the better CISO is the one that's saying, well, wait a minute, what does the business want to do? Tell me what your business objective is, business strategy. There's going to be an IT strategy. And now let's have a conversation. To accomplish that, we're going to expose ourselves to certain risks. Are you okay with the costs to manage that risk to an acceptable level? Because if the answer is no, then we should be having an interactive conversation, because we may need to revise the strategy or even the objectives, right? So the CEOs that get that are taking ownership of this and are looking for the CISO to provide the data. This is a partnership, right? To the question about the board of directors having liability and particularly fiduciary obligation, absolutely. I think it helps if you're having the right, calm, disciplined, transparent conversation. It's not about fear, right? Because it's about being able to defend the answers that you come up with. Well, the men and women that run our companies do that every day. I think most of them, on balance, are making good decisions with the objectives and the best interests of their entire institution in mind. So if you put this in that perspective and say, hang on a second, you really do know more about cyber than you think, right? Product recalls are a perfect example. Why do companies have product recalls? Well, it's usually to protect the company, but it's also about that information. When I got a product recall for a Takata airbag, and not to single them out, it could have been Tylenol, it could have been, your car's sudden vehicle acceleration, it could have been lettuce for E. coli, whatever the things are. You make a decision about whether to continue operating and behaving in a certain way, right? I drove my car with the problem with the airbags the day before I knew about it. I wasn't aware that I was accepting that risk. Suddenly the next day, now I have that knowledge and I can make the decision about whether, because it's perfectly okay to accept risks you're aware of and find to be within your appetite, it's not okay to accept risk by default because they lack awareness of their existence. And to me, that's the relationship. The CISO fly on the wall at the table, listening to what the business wants to do, saying, by the way, to do that, these are the risks that are involved. We're trying to make sure it's not our job to say yes or no. It's our job to make sure the conversation is informed.
I'm going to park it for 1 second because I'd love to come back to Christine and just ask you to build your thoughts on Jason's answer there, especially with regards to the role of the CISO, given that you're reasonably new in that role within your organization, despite having a wealth of experience in the sector. And I'm sure the American football analogy works in Helsinki. But we've got a couple of questions that have come in from people who've joined the webinar. One quick one. With regards to that first question of what do you feel executives need to understand about security? First question was, what have you changed your mind about in the last decade? Jason talked a lot about trust and capturing data, but obviously we're framing this through 2023. Very quickly, Jim, what have you changed your mind about in the last 10 years?
I respect the threats in a different way now. I think with the advent of things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, with the advent of more sophisticated threat matrices, and some of the things that they're able to accomplish, and then the addition of sort of nation states and the interactions of these types of things. So I think I've always been threat oriented, but I think I've become more so lately, because I think the better you understand potential adversaries, the better you can really kind of evaluate your risk. So for me, it always comes back to risk, right? And the more I can understand threats. So it's always been core, but I would say that's where I've just completely put all my focus at that point.
And we've got one other question from Daniel Rock that I wanted to throw out there. And I think, Christine, I'll come back to you on that role of the CISO question in just a moment. So a quick thought on this, perhaps from Jim or Jason, because I think it might be related to to some stuff in the US at the minute. But how much do you feel the impact of the conviction of Joseph Sullivan, the former CISO of Uber, has had on CISOs? And how do you feel the sentencing will impact security practitioners? We were talking about liability perhaps to the board, but that must have an impact on your community, perhaps closer to home. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll just, my 2 cents is, I think a lot of people in the community have sent in letters in support of taking that, not being sentenced so heavily kind of thing, because it takes more, it takes 2 to tango, as it were. So singling somebody out like that, and I think there's a lot of nuance behind these types of things. But like I said earlier, I think it's really making people aware. It's like, wow, I can go to jail, so maybe I didn't quite sign up for that, or maybe it makes them relook at their employment contract and their investments. And over to you, Jason, I think.
I'm going to combine those 2 questions. I was very fortunate to have worked with and for some amazing teams. And I paid attention through most of my career, and I learned from those wonderful experiences. As a result, the things that I've been saying, the things that I've been espousing, evangelizing, whatever term you want to use, I haven't changed what I've been saying in 35 years. The world's finally caught up. So I look at this, certainly not for him as an individual or the organization or their stakeholders, but I think of it as a good thing. Number one, and I don't have any inside information on this. I'm only, reacting to what I've learned about it from the reports in the media. Arguably, he did something he shouldn't have done. He made it worse by lying about it and then tried to cover up the lie, right? By calling a ransomware a bug bounty and saying that it wasn't a ransom that you paid, you were trying to put a spin on it. You've got to be transparent. You've got to be forthcoming. One of those wise people that I worked with before is a guy named Mark Rash, who is a security evangelist extraordinaire. And he's famous for saying that everybody in the company has someone whose title is vice president going to jail. They just don't know it yet, right? So I think the good CISO has to make sure that it's not their title, nor is it the title of any of the senior leadership that you're working with. And how do you do that? Again, it's a partnership. The CISO isn't supposed to go to the board and beg for money. I think that is all too common, right? The CISO says, I don't have the budget. I don't have the money I need to do what this organization needs to have to achieve that appropriate objective. That's not your job. right? And I say in certain organizations, you may have been empowered that way, but it's really supposed to be a partnership. We have to go to leadership and say, of the things for which you are accountable, so National Association of Corporate Directors has some guidance, IT Governance Institute, a bunch of these groups have some guidance that say, here are the questions to which you board members need to have answers. I can be the one to help go away and get those answers, but ultimately we have to decide, here's where we are, here's where we want to be, how quickly do we want to close that gap, right? Typically that's going to take 2, 3, 4 years and an appropriate amount of spend. So if anything happens in the interim, I'm not the one that didn't say, plug that hole. I'm not the one that said, don't give me money to do that, right? So I think in better organizations, money's not the issue, it's time, right? Because as Jim's talked about it, that desired end state, that's changed. It used to be that you could articulate a plan, 3-4 year roadmap, make the appropriate investments and kind of get pretty close to what your target state was. And then you were, I won't call it maintenance mode, but then as paradigm shifted, we moved to the cloud, we moved to work from home, then you had to, tailor things accordingly, expand accordingly to get the coverage you wanted. But I think the desired end state for most companies is moving away from us faster than most of us have the resources to chase and to get down. Right. So that's a horrible situation to be in. So if that's what they're reacting to, again, don't put that on the CISO, that's on the organization. That has to be the conversation. And increasingly, I hate the term GRC because certain things people at the executive suite think is a product instead of a process, but it really goes to governance is really what this is about. Are we spending on the right things? Are we getting the investment we should? And if not, we need to do a course correction. Right now, cyber's all within that. And the good CISOs have always thought about it that way. Our job is just to put it in the terms so that we fit within those larger business processes of the organization.
So, Christine, Jason's saying don't put that on the CISO. If we come back to that idea of what is the CISO there for, you are reasonably new in this particular post. What do you think the CISO is there for?
Well, I may be new in the post, but I have had discussions with CISO, so it's maybe it wouldn't be such a new opinion like anyway, because when we built our products and services, then they are typically tailored for CISOs anyway. But before answering that question, your question earlier on what made what changed my mind, which also is helping CISOs nowadays, is the government, like in the past decade. Because I mean, before now, we have been preaching, like cybersecurity people have been preaching for the mountaintops, do this, do that, etc., etc. And then regulations caught up. And then it just became so much easier because companies now, they need to be compliant in different areas with various regulations, and they actually get fines if they are non-compliant. So that has been very helpful that different governments in different countries have realized that the digital world is actually part of where they need to also secure people and their rights and organizations beyond what we have in the physical world. So definitely very happy with that. And like today, so the CISO's role, I have been quite fortunate that in this organization in WithSecure where I'm in, so the CISO is actually having an executive seat. And I would have to say that in an executive position, even though the CISO may not necessarily have still all the budgets in the world, the value of influence in the organization can be a very strong currency. And this can actually translate into time that different units and functions in the organization will spend on cybersecurity, because this now becomes like an executive level decision. And this is merely about like talking to your peers in the executive position that if this is the targets and the business outcomes that they would like to have in their area, and this is now the discussion about the risks in that area, what's the level of risk that they're willing to accept? What's the level of risk that they would like to mitigate? And how much would that translate into either monetary or time that their people will have to spend?
David, if I could.
Yeah, quickly. Yeah, absolutely.
One of the other things that has changed, not necessarily about CISOs, but about the environment in which we operate. Obviously, there's an evolving threat landscape. And I think a couple of different sectors are reacting to that. The regulators and legislators in countries all over the world have suddenly picked up on this issue as one that their constituents care about, and they want to show that they're doing something to solve the problem. I think there needs to be a really careful balance You want to legislate certain things, but you don't want to get into the bit level details. So to do security, or whatever that means, certainly means something different in different companies, in different countries, in different sizes. You know, it's not one size fits all. So if you want to say you need to pick one of the standard controls frameworks and align your program with it, maybe there's one in your sector. Yeah, I'm good with that kind of legislation, but don't get much more specific than that, because then you could be burdening certain people with costs that aren't appropriate for them. So I think you want that legislative burden to be there, because then I can use this as a CISO to help drive change in the organization. I'm not a tax on operations. If you want to operate in the EU, for example, you have to have data localization. You can't have your data in a cloud back in California, right? So that's just a cost of doing business there. I can help you as a CISO meet those requirements. Same thing with the compliance burden. Increasingly, this has become something that is now strategic. We're not slowing the business down anymore. There's some, I think, more old school executives who still think that way, right? I said, we're offensive. We're helping us score as well. Well, if there is a cyber renewal premium that you have experienced and it's come back 3, 4, 5x what it was before, because we know that the insurance companies are taking a bath because they didn't price it right. Well, don't try to solve that on us. And I don't mean to be critical of them. I'm saying this in a constructive way. Those insurance questionnaires that they have to fill out, they're not well conceived. You know, as an example, how many employees do you have in your organization? Perfect question to ask. And let's just say I say 5,000. How many of them have MFA? If I don't say 5,000, they're going to conclude I've got risk that they don't want to underwrite and my premiums are going up. Well, wait a second. Do 5,000 need MFA? What if you're a manufacturing organization and the majority of your workforce is working machinery in the plant and has no access to your IT stack? Maybe I don't need MFA, right? So, I mean, those questions beget a lack of understanding about what we do. So we have to write addendums, and when you do it the right way, you can come back and get flat renewals, or in some cases demonstrate that you are saving the company money by getting reductions in your premiums if you're not underwriting that risk. So that, to me, is what's good about the changing environment, the regulations, because we can show that we're helping, you know, return on investment is much more important than just keeping the bad thing from happening, because it was always hard to prove that negative anyway.
We've danced around, or maybe not danced around, but we've talked a lot about money, and Jason specifically said money isn't the issue, it's time. But a question did come in from Priyanka, and it was building on one of Christine's points. So I'll come to Christine, and Jason and Jim, you might also have some points on this. But they said for the impact of CISOs need, for the impact that CISOs need to have, it's to do with the authority, right, that budgets present to someone. If so, how can CISOs operate if they don't have the money to do so? So specifically, if you don't have that money, how can you operate? Christine, if I come to you first, just because it was built on your initial point.
So essentially, as I mentioned as well earlier, if you don't have the budget, there's one thing that you could have, which is really valuable if you are like elevated on a higher level in the organization as a CISO, and that is influence. And that influence will translate to time. So for example, if I have influence over how IT would spend their time when it comes to vulnerability patching, when it comes to evaluating third-party applications, when it comes to implementing SSOs like all over the place. If I have the influence to that, I don't necessarily really need to have all of the budgets to evaluate all of these third parties, because these people can allocate a portion of their time to spend on this. Now, of course, I'm not saying that money is not important, because there are a lot of things that could really be helped to bring in, like new technologies, external services, etc. But if, for example, in the current economic climate that we have, if it really becomes so that there is nothing else that the CISO can do, and the money has really reached the ceiling of the budget, then it's time to explore areas of the organization that can work with influence and leveraging other people's time to help solve the cybersecurity issues.
Any last points on that before we move on?
I just would like just to say, I completely agree with Christine, but I'm going to give one caveat, if I may, and that is, if you have zero budget as a CISO, I come from the school that you should have zero accountability, right? In other words, it's one thing to infuse security into other parts of the business and building relationships, which I think is a requirement no matter what your budget is, right? I think you really need to build these kind of relationships, but at the same time, it's if you don't have the budget to take action on things that you believe are critical to manage risk according to the business, and you have to sort of negotiate for that, you're sort of negotiating risk mitigation. And if the executive says that we need to address this risk, and you're not getting the means to do that, and you're leveraging your own internal relationships, and maybe it gets done, maybe it doesn't, maybe you get the opportunity to monitor it, maybe you don't, then all of a sudden something goes sideways and your phone rings. It's like, well, wait a second. There's a little bit, and this is why it's kind of hard to keep CISO sometimes. But I think I'm all about not just throwing money at problems. I think budgets need to be there. And I think if there's a way of organizing how things need to get done, like a risk management process, and getting everybody on the same page, and the executive community driving that through these different elements that are substantiate the relationships, like Christine said, you can get there. But we just have to be very, very careful with just plugging in a CISO.
So, David, a couple quick reactions to that. Number one, if this webinar is really intended to help educate non-IT executives about what cyber is about, and if they're looking to help really address this appropriately, you're gonna have to find a good CISO. That is a fit that has to go in both directions. As CISOs, we've all said, I will only work for a company that gets it. Well, what does that mean? That means you're invited to have a seat at the table. The authority matches your responsibility, those kinds of questions. Do I expect to get all the funding I want every time? Because I'm not begging the board for funding, but I am making a recommendation about which things we spend money on and how much it will take. But if you substituted that person's question, if you substituted CISO and you substituted in CIO or CTO or any other COO or other officer, if you asked them if they got all the money that they wanted, I would dare say any of them ever said that they got as much as they needed, right? We're always putting this in the enterprise perspective of what are the needs of the business and which one's the biggest deal. It's up to us to talk about and align with the business. So if there is a strategic initiative that the business is undertaking, we have to evaluate what are the risks to that initiative and talk about how we are part of that budget. So it's not this separate, discrete thing. Again, there's a caveat. Most organizations have some sort of shared infrastructure that everybody rides on it, and you have to meet the minimum baseline. There is first. So going with the next question, I think I hit that one.
Perfect.
Closed it out.
Let's move topics on slightly, because Christ, we're halfway through already. Time is flying. Jim, you mentioned about risk and compliance and that pendulum between risk and compliance and technology. When we were prepping for this session, you talked and mused on the idea that whilst compliance doesn't mean you're secure, does being secure mean that you are compliant? And that might be a question that business leaders are asking themselves. So what do you think? Whilst compliance doesn't mean you're secure, does being secure mean that you are compliant?
So this is always really interesting to me. So the short answer is being secure almost always means you're going to be compliant, because a lot of compliance requirements and standards are really sort of reflecting certain behaviors and certain intent of ensuring security, right? Not across the board. There are special cases, of course, right? But I'll go a little bit, kind of reflect off what Jason said concerning things like regulatory and standards and things of that nature. I mean, just in the past couple of weeks, even the TSA has now rolled out security requirements for airlines, so everybody's jumping in, okay? And if you really cut back and you look at things like NIST CSF or the NIST cybersecurity framework, is in that framework, they actually have references to other standards like 853 or COBIT or, pick your poison, ISO 27000 and stuff like that. So there's already this natural interconnective tissue between all these types of standards, and even with regulations. And regulations are always going to be behind the curve because it takes time for them to sort of put out what they're going to require you to do. And so by the time it hits you as a company, it's a little stale. And you'll find that if you take a solid approach to ensuring the fundamentals of security are done, because at the end of the day, we all want security to be sexy and all this kind of stuff, but it really is hard work every day in the trenches doing things that are just not fun. And if you do those things and you ensure your policies are in place, you ensure governance is in place, and it's all based on aligning to risk and understanding those expectations, you're going to be compliant with a lot of scenarios. Now, that doesn't mean you're fully compliant by any stretch of imagination, because sometimes organizations expect you to achieve a certain requirement that you do not maybe see risk in. So then it becomes managing the risk of non-compliance in that sense. But I think you can be very competent and have a higher degree of confidence in your compliance if you've achieved a good baseline of security capability. But it's not, unfortunately, it's not an all be all, but it's the same thing. Is unfortunately, compliance does not equal security. So if you start with security, you'll get there. You'll get to be compliant as well.
Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah.
There we
Yes,
go.
one thing to add, sorry, by the way, was that because I joined the CISO office team a bit recently, and since my background was a CTO and working with different products, I was like always security, 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 and then there's too many different controls and requirements. And I was like, do I really need to worry about all of this? And so my head of compliance, the one who's like facilitating with us to the governance for the whole organization, was telling me that if you worry about the security and you figure out that in this security space, we really do well as an organization, we elevate our cyber hygiene, we have the right kind of controls in place, then the compliance will take care of itself. And I think, like, since she has been working on this for a while, I do believe that this elevation of cyber hygiene, like helping our cybersecurity posture in the organization, has only helped her make governance easier, especially when we need to renew some of these things annually.
I 100% agree with what Christine just said. I want to footstop that even further. If you have an organization that's willing to work with you and take a slightly longer term perspective, because in the short term, it's going to cost more to be secure than to be compliant, right? In the long term, though, because the compliance rules change, even though they don't necessarily keep up, you will have achieved an efficiency so that when the new thing crops up, you don't have to be reactive. You've probably already anticipated it. And here's the even better part. When I started doing this, a lot of the contracts I had with federal government customers, the costs of that were borne by the contract, right? Because the government didn't necessarily expect that commercial organizations had robust security programs of their own. Well, that thinking's changed. Now most companies say, no, I expect, of course you have your own cybersecurity program. You don't get to charge me for that. You chose to go into that business. You chose to work with this type of data or in this sector or in this geography. That's a cost of doing business. So if you approach it that way and you are secure, then if the customer says something, to Jim's point, where you didn't think it was a risk, that's a very different conversation. I'm not doing it because it's compliant. Whatever crazy thing you want me to do, Mr. Customer, if you're willing to support the cost because you think that's part of what you need, then I can help generate revenue. Of course, that's what the cloud providers essentially have done. When we first started putting workloads in the cloud, none of them understood that they had this security burden, that they had to partner with us, that in the healthcare space, many of them were considered business associates. They refused to believe that, right? And they argued against it. And I said, well, hang on a second, guys. I'm not saying you have to do all of this out of the goodness of your health, or even have to do it for everybody. But for companies who want to get these things from you with economies of scale, price it in, drive additional revenue, right? Use security as a differentiator if you want. So it's a very different conversation when you approach it that way. Now, again, you're thinking like a business person. The CISO's job is to remove obstacles to the company's success. I'm constantly doing this with the smaller organizations who don't have the wherewithal to have a Christine or a Jim with them, working with them full time, right? So my job is to anticipate the questions they're going to get from customers, regulators, venture capitalists, if they're in the early stages of raising capital, or cyber insurance underwriters. What are the requirements? It used to be you didn't have to have MFA. Now, I don't care how big you are, whether you're a multinational or a 3-person startup, you got to have MFA or you're not getting cyber coverage, right? So it's those kinds of things that when you are secure, you have that in place, you're more readily able to respond to those changing market conditions.
Listening to you talk there, it sounds to me like there is a maturing around this. You talk about the cost of doing business. It would seem that more organizations do understand these issues. And yet, again, when we were kind of lining up this panel, one of the questions was, is our current approach to security akin to plugging the gaps that are appearing in a dam, and what might be a better approach, which would sound like a question that's primed at the odds of what we're talking about, that there's a lot of organizations who aren't there, who don't understand the costs of business, who are very reactive. Is that fair?
Well, from my perspective, the smalls, they're not active or reactive or proactive. You know, they're just, you know, they're waking up every day figuring out how they can turn their hours into a revenue stream. And frankly, it's only when security is getting in the way that they have the motivation to address that question. So I am trying to promote them. I'm trying to build shared infrastructure, you know, that the cloud, again, if you're small, it makes a lot of sense to go to the cloud because you can inherit the security controls and the greater posture from them. They're not going to do everything for you, but they're probably doing more than you can do on your own. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, the mediums and the large organizations, again, it's not a question of budget, it's a question of time. If and when you can get out in front of it and you're meeting the baseline requirements, I think you are designing with resiliency in mind is a perfect example. So I think most companies, as wrong as it was to be 100% on-prem, same reason it's wrong to be 100% in the cloud. You just move those single points of failure from one location to the other, right? When Dyn DNS, the East Coast DNS service, got hit with a massive DDoS attack, everybody's websites, they couldn't resolve. They were out of business, right? So we just took that single point of failure and moved it into the cloud. And now we're moving from single cloud to multi-cloud, right? So that resiliency is what's important. If you have that in place, then we're able to get out in front of this a little bit because, and then if you combine that with a few other strategies, most organizations now know micro segmentation so that you can contain the inevitable breach, right? We're not trying to prevent it. We're just trying to add cost. Maybe, you know, the adage about the grizzly bear, I don't have to outrun the grizzly bear. I just have to outrun the other company that I'm competing with so that the bad actors have another target. So I think that there are companies that are still reactive and frankly will always be because they don't get it. But eventually when there's enough pain and motivation because of they've lost business, they've lost customer confidence, and let's put it this way, some companies, it will take an actual security event or breach for them to get religion. And that doesn't mean I won't do business with them. Sometimes companies who've done it, they had the aha moment and said, oh, this stuff matters. And depending on how well they handled that breach, I may be more devoted to them than a company that I never had a problem with to begin with. So it's not dire circumstances, and I certainly wouldn't give up if you're a CISO working for a company that doesn't quite get it. You know, work with others, use peer influence, and as Christine mentioned, it's about social capital as much as actual capital when you're trying to convince organizations of the need to be a little more proactive.
Christine, if I just come to you very quickly, because Jason there mentioned understanding pain to get the religion. And I know that kind of you grapple with the idea that you need to kind of bake people into the process, HR, our HR or our development willing. Where do your human colleagues feature in cybersecurity?
They feature everywhere. So humans are, well, because a lot of these technologies are built for us. And we are, I wouldn't say central, but we are a variable, like a pretty big variable when it comes to different technologies that we work with, as well as cybersecurity, because these attacks are essentially targeting the misuse of this technology and exploiting them in order to target what's important to us, like the so-called crown jewels. So for instance, if data is important, then how do you exploit these technologies in order to gain access to these things? And the challenge that I'm seeing nowadays is that, and this has been happening quite a bit as well, is that if we build technologies that don't really think about how do humans go about their day. I mean, how do developers start in the morning? They are typically more attuned to not click on phishing links in the morning than late in the day when they're so tired and they want to go home. So if we don't bake the human experience, the human workflows, and how humans psychologically behave into the technologies that we are building, then we can't really expect people to get it. And we can't really just tell them humans are the weakest link and then just go away. And I think it's unfair to humans and frankly, quite lazy as well when we are designing these technologies. So I'm a pretty big advocate for designing technologies that are easy to use and hard to misuse, especially from a cybersecurity perspective.
Just on a reminder, of course, that we'd love questions from those watching. We've got about 15 minutes left. We've had a comment from Powell. Compliance people are usually lawyers, while CISOs are tech guys. I suppose that's a bit of a reaction as opposed to a question. But Jim, given that this is what we've been treading over the last 5-10 minutes, just a bit of reaction to that comment?
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the problems is, remember that pendulum, okay? Back in the 90s, and I'd be interested to see Christine and Jason if they agree with this or not, but back in the 90s, it kind of swung back and forth pretty quick. It was like, well, we got compliance, let's focus on technology, because that was advancing. More and more compliance was coming out. Things like, SB 800s, things were kind of standards were beginning to materialize. BS 7799 became an ISO standard. So it was like this sort of ladder effect of security. I mean, back then we called it security, like gates and guards, and then it was information security. Now, of course, it's cyber. But I think because the pendulum swung to technology and sort of went clink and stuck over there for so long, we were demanding more technical expertise from our security people at the higher and higher levels of the business. Oh, well, you know the technology, so you must know how to figure everything out. And so I think in some cases we have a very technically oriented CISO community, but I think that's become sort of the center of the bullseye, when in fact there's a lot of well-balanced capabilities in that particular space. But a little bit to, I think, Christine and Jason's point earlier, is we're not finding ways of fully leveraging that, because we're not necessarily seen as, maybe not necessarily always in that boardroom kind of conversation, if I may be so bold. We're seen as the technical person that is to reference the infrastructure. So I actually am a little anti the word cybersecurity, because it implies it's only a technical problem, where I would rather start off with the concept of risk and work through how technology can play a role in that piece of it. I can actually speak really a long time about that comment, by the way. And I'll say one more thing real quickly, because Christina really said some amazing things about people. I just want to leave everybody with this thought, for those in the business space that are listening, is security people have historically, and a lot of people, even just in IT, people go, wow, people are the problem, right? We all heard stories of people using CD-ROM drives as cup holders, okay? So the thing is that is if you have one employee or 1 million employees, or let's say 100,000 employees, try to look at this as an asset, okay? So engage with them, make security sort of meaningful to them as individuals. How can they help themselves, their families be more secure? How can they avoid, being scammed? Because people get scammed every day. It just so happens when it happens on your business computer, you get caught up in that scam, right? Ransomware gets floated out, and the rest is history. So lots to share with that comment. A lot happened in the last 3 minutes I needed to comment on. I see Jason wanting to jump in, so I'll hand it over to you, Jason.
Jumping at the bit, absolutely, just like you, Jim. So I think that observation about the how CISOs are often technical and compliance or other people are lawyers is fairly apt. I have seen that a lot. Implied in that conversation are some other things. So let's kind of pull the thread a little bit. Counsel gets attention at the board and senior leadership. And a lot of people in our industry often go after advanced degrees, maybe a PhD, so that they'll get the recognition and the attention. And when they say something, it will carry more weight. Because if I had ESQ after my name, I'm sure everything that I've been saying, people would have been paying attention long before the world caught up to me, right? But you have to have a relationship with counsel. Now, good counsel is going to be your partner. Sometimes counsel only cares about preserving the legal remedies for when the breach occurs. They care less about preventing the breach in the first place, right? And I'm not saying that's wrong. Sometimes the counsel is charged with, we want to do X as a business. Find me a way to do X that doesn't violate the law, as opposed to putting that same question to the CISO, find me a way of doing X that doesn't put us at risk, right? That's a much broader conversation. And frankly, both are it's a parable about the elephant. You're only looking at parts of the puzzle. I think the CISO and compliance and counsel and whoever the other key stakeholders are in your governance organization need to come together. Because if any one of us goes into the corner office and points to the sky, it's Chicken Little, sky's falling. But if 4 or 5 of us come together, we're going to get leadership's attention. They're going to say, wait a minute, there's something here that we have to pay attention to. Let's have that conversation. So I think it can be a very good ally. And the reason for that, coming back to the other point that we talked about with people, everybody says people's the weakest link. Where's the problem? Until the machines cut us out of everything completely, that's going to hold true. And maybe even afterwards, because you still need somebody to feed the machines. People are also our strongest weapon, right? Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If you are not creating a culture of security mindedness, and that, again, like if in terms of how your policies are, if you punish people, we all have a policy that says, one of the interesting new things is about phishing. So if you fail a phishing attack using your simulated internal anti-phishing campaign tools, if you fail that attack 2, 3, 4 times in a row, and then you get hit with a real one, and the person that clicked that link that caused the breach was somebody that you knew wasn't doing the right thing, wasn't behaving the right way, and you didn't take the appropriate actions, the organization can now be held liable, right? That's a new concern that lawyers are starting to raise. Are we exposed to that possibility? So you've got to have, instead of punishing them when they click the phishing link and fail to detect it, because as Christine mentioned, it's late in the day, they're low on coffee and they're tired and they're just trying to get their job done. Reward the good behavior, right? Promote the kinds of behavior that you want. There's lots of ways of doing that, but that, what the rank and file need to understand is, as the security officer, if they come to you with any question, regardless of how sophisticated or minuscule it is, they'll never get in trouble for checking, when in doubt, check it out, right? And if they're in a situation where somebody's trying to social engineer their way in, they're on the phone, they're in person, they're yelling and screaming at them, they need to know you will take the customer service hit. There's no acceptability for being disrespectful, but the bad guys prey on those fears of getting in trouble, and it's by doing the thing that they shouldn't do that actually causes them to get in trouble in the first place. So if you say it's a safe space, you don't have to worry about risking losing a sale or alienating a customer. I'll take that hit. Be polite, put me in touch with them, and then we can have the conversation. That's the way to affect a positive change in culture. And I think that addresses some of the questions that we just talked about.
I'll stick with you, Jason. I want to just switch the theme again slightly, moving into the last part of our hour. At the top of the hour, we talked about the fact that business leaders, you must always be on the lookout for new risks, new threats. What are those risks and what's coming?
So understand what our job is. Our job is not perfect security. Our job is to add costs and slow bad actors down. That's essentially what we do. And that's the same thing as the inside intelligence mission, a forward deployed mission, whatever it is, it's all the same techniques. Tools are a little bit different. So if that's the case, there's an evolving threat landscape. What are the new threats that we have to worry about? Because as we plug those holes, the bad actors were thwarted in their objective, they're going to work around it. So, you have to think about how they could get in, how they could compromise you. Right now, we saw originally back in the day, they went after the network. We did a pretty good job of protecting the network. So then they moved to the application, right? And if you remember that the controls in the standard said you have to scan for network vulnerabilities, then now you have to scan for software vulnerabilities. What's the third word in all of those standards? Hardware, software, firmware. People ignore that word like it's not even on the page, all right? And they ignore it at their peril, because everybody, we're talking about Industry 4.0, digital transformation, and whether they have embedded OT or they're trying to use their IT to control OT, and by that I mean operations technology, everything from irrigation pumps in an agricultural setting, laser CNC cutters in a manufacturing setting, or medical devices in a hospital setting. That's all OT, right? You're trying to control it, manage it. That's how they're coming in. Because if you scan those devices, and if you did it in a way that didn't lock the device up, because that's something to be worried about. The stuff's decades old in many cases. It's never been patched, and I'm not defaulting I'm not disparaging the manufacturers. They didn't design this with security in mind. They didn't know how we were going to be using it this way or this extensively, right? So, what are we doing about it? To me, that's now the next big. I wouldn't even call it an emerging threat. It's been there all along. There's lots of opportunities and lots of vulnerabilities in that space that have been cataloged, and we aren't necessarily aware of them. So coming full circle, is it okay to accept that risk? Not if you're not aware of it. Go do some, Microsoft's going to make it easy, not to plug them, but they have a new capability that's out called Defender for IoT, right? So I'm not telling people who have access to their admin console, I'm not telling you to go scan your OT, right? Because again, I don't want you locking things up. We make sure, work with Microsoft, understand what those capabilities are, but deploy the sensors, discover what's on there. Because again, you can't manage it if you don't know about it. Once you then know, now we have to come up with some practical solutions. And here's the challenge. Most of those companies that you say there's a vulnerability in your product, they're going to say you have to buy our current version. We don't have spare billions of dollars lying around to replace our entire OT stack. So for some period of time, you're going to have to continue to use that legacy equipment. And there's no way a company is going to come up with a meaningful, defensible strategy for doing that if you're not working with your CISO.
Christine, I'd love to just get your thoughts on this as well. And I'm aware that we're beginning to run short on time, but you're out there as a business with Secure hunting for threats and confronting live attacks. What are you seeing?
Well, Jason mentioned the word legacy. And if I look back at the past 2 decades in this industry, the growth of technology that we have seen has actually been quite amazing. It has been quite spectacular. But the impact to different organizations as well is that we are quicker today at adopting new technologies than we are at deprecating legacy or old ones. So we just keep on adding to the pile, and then we expect that we can secure all of this. And with every technology comes different potential for vulnerabilities, potential for things that needed to be exploited. So moving forward, the attack surface for different organizations are just actually getting wider and wider. And of course, this is an opportunity for different threat actors to sort of like just pick and mix what works well for them. So for instance, like messaging applications, I mean, we have had email for a long time, and then we added Teams and Slack and Signal and WhatsApp and so many different things. But what have we removed? Because we have called some of these new applications email killers, but email just doesn't die. So, and that's just one aspect. That's just the messaging. So there are more and more things. And Jason mentioned about OT, like a lot of the different technologies we had then that was offline now are becoming part of this whole new Internet of Things, and industrial IoT is very common. So if everything is online, and this is the width of our attack surface, this is the area that different organizations and executives in the organization would need to understand that how do we do business when this is actually the digital surface that we are now operating in, because this is the reality of the day and even more so in the future.
We've covered a huge amount of ground in the last hour, and we equally have not covered half of what we could have done. But we've got literally 2 minutes left, and I'd love to get around each of you on this last point. So 30 seconds each if you can, keep it relatively brief, but one takeaway that you feel the business leader watching should remember following this panel. Jason, if I start with you.
So I'm going to give you my one takeaway, and I'm also going to try to address the last question that came into the chat. Which was that's going
to be impressive in 30 seconds.
Yeah. So the answer is you want to seek counsel, and I don't mean lawyer. I mean seek the advice of a knowledgeable cybersecurity practitioner, CISO, whatever it might be. It's got to fit your organization. So if you're large, hire somebody. Should be a good bi-directional fit, but then listen to them. Right? Don't ignore them. Engage them. Invite them to have a seat at the table. If you're small and you can't afford it, that's where this virtual CISO model comes in. But you should be work with your peers, join an incubator. A lot of times they have, like we do, we have a CISO in residence, so that resource can be shared. Definitely can take advantage of the cloud. You can't inherit it all, but you can inherit probably a solid third, and maybe that middle third is shared in terms of responsibility, leaving a third on you. And then there are MSSPs, certainly, for a lot of your infrastructure. But most CISOs just will talk to you, have the conversation, and that's what it's about. You make sure you talk to whomever it is that's your resources. Your cyber insurance underwriter will also have conversations with you. Again, there's lots of good resources that don't require you to spend, the theoretical hundreds of thousands it would take to hire a full-time CISO.
Amazing. Christine?
So for executives, if you don't understand your cybersecurity leaders, encourage and support them to learn the language of business. They will then understand what are the areas that you care about and speak your language. Like a lot of our CISOs today have technical backgrounds. And like for myself, to be honest, I'm still learning to speak the language of business. So for CISOs, if you have been too immersed in technical things for more than a decade in your career, it takes time to master a new vocabulary. And for executives, do support them on this. Then you'll be able to have more meaningful conversations.
And Jim, a last brief word from yourself.
Don't underestimate how much you can accomplish in security. It's a very organic process. It takes a team in many ways. And a little bit, arguably somewhat self-serving, as I'll build off what Jason was saying, is for a lot of organizations that don't have executive level security expertise at their disposal, vCISO is an excellent option to be able to have those conversations. And it's usually the best case scenario because you may not need somebody just full time all the time. Sometimes it's nice to be able to have somebody to rely on an incremental basis to help drive that vision forward and help establish the relationships that Christine talked about earlier and help create that momentum for security in your environment.
Jason, Christine, Jim, thank you for your time today and for joining this webinar to talk through the threats and what business leaders should be thinking about. And for everyone who joined the session, thank you for taking time out of your day to do so.
Thank you.